YouTube recommendations because I don't know.
And we're live. Alrighty. So, welcome, viewer. Today we will be examining the manifesto by Brenton Tarrant, the ideological terrorist behind the Christchurch massacre. Why we are only seeing a quarantine of this mimetic virus and no treatments, vaccinations, or immunity. This is not sufficient, in our opinion, to solve the issues that this demographic are radicalizing for. We want to present arguments and an evaluation so one doesn't need to throw their life away to a losing cause if it is indeed losing, which we will go into. As there may be better ways to go about solving these tribulations that they are facing. Now, if you are in New Zealand, please refrain from watching this, as while we won't be sharing the manifesto, we are unsure of the local legality of discussing it. Who are we? Well, I'm Ben, a Aussie and founder of Bevery, which is the channel you're listening to now. And I'm joined here by John, an American and the screenwriter of The Anti-Nationalist. Together, we're part of Bevery, an open community to transform isolated and competitive wisdom into collaborative wisdom through weekly discussions like this and software projects to facilitate them. What we'll cover in this call is the overview. What we'll cover is a character of Brenton, who he is, a little bit of history about him, summary of his manifesto, the terminology he uses, so we can come to terms with what his views are, and are his fears real? What was his goals? Did he achieve it? And what alternative solutions are suitable and unsuitable to address his fears, and where to go from there? Let us know your comments and feedback. We are a collaborative effort. We are keen to hear from you, and also keen to have you also join calls like this so we can facilitate that collaborative wisdom. Alrighty, so we think it's probably good to kind of just share what our personal goals is for this, because this is definitely going to be the most intense video we've done. We've done many videos on philosophy, psychology, and other type of things in this field, politics, build it up over the years, bit by bit by bit, and now we kind of feel qualified where we can actually wrestle with this rather than just run from it. Personally, for myself, I'm an Aussie. The Christchurch massacre, when it happened, was like, oh my God, even Aussies are doing intense things, even if it's in New Zealand, and that's so close to home. And that was actually one of Brenton's intents. His intent of targeting New Zealand was to show that the issues that he perceives are everywhere and that the solution needs to be everywhere. His solution. So I, do what I do, what my personality traits align for me to do, which is I kind of align with a protector archetype, or a general masculine archetype, even though I don't look that masculine, but I have one hell of a brain on me, so that's good. But yeah, so I read through it, and I came up with some arguments, but I never heard those arguments shared. And we've been covering propaganda in our recent series. We last week we covered the Unabomber Manifesto. As we're working our way through these things, we're feeling more capable to wrestle with these challenges and do diligence to them. It's just something where it's I can sympathize a lot with them. I have friends in who have gone down. I wouldn't, no, that's not true. So I have friends who are also sympathetic to that ideology. However, I think there's better arguments for it, even though it is very hard to make those arguments. They're not shared. And as research for this discussion, I looked and I searched Twitter, I searched YouTube, I searched DuckDuckGo. I couldn't find counter arguments. So we have counter arguments and we have concerns about it as well. And we want to share them to facilitate discussion, because as we said, just saying you're stupid or these experiences aren't real, or you're a madman doesn't solve it. And if they could get these ideologues get presented with something that could solve the things they are concerned with, then maybe they'll elect for that instead. John, what's your goals for this call?
Yeah, I typically try to reserve myself as being mostly apolitical online, both on my Twitter stream and usually through these as well. Even though personally, I probably have some like further right leanings, just in temperament wise, and also in um, uh, some of the policies, some of the policies that I might agree with. So I think that most people will just be automatically dissuaded by anything that might be written in the not the Unabomber Manifesto, but the Christchurch Shooters Manifesto. And so there's already like no real reason for them to like actually wrestle with the arguments. But I think probably for people that are maybe a little bit more like you or I, that are more on the right and actually concerned with some of the issues that are brought up by the author in this manifesto, and not having any sort of like responses being brought forward against these arguments. I think it's definitely serious and needs to be taken care of, or at least attempted to be taken care of by you and I here. And so I'm going to try to speak from much more on this sort of hard right sort of leaning side. And I think there are still arguments that can be made from the same types of temperaments of people like, what is it, Brenton, and the people that might normally be persuaded by this manifesto against it. Like, because that's usually how these things go. I think a lot of people are mostly persuaded based upon their own gut instincts or what they've already become accustomed to in regards to values and ethics and things like that. And so for something to be brought up that goes completely against those, there's just going to be no swaying power to it. So that's why I'm wanting to sort of like bring up some arguments and defenses for the people that would normally be swayed by something as extreme as this paper.
Right. Yeah. And in Brenton's own words, he says when he was young, he was a communist, then an anarchist, then a libertarian before becoming an eco-fascist. And he would put ethno-nationalists as a subcategory of eco-fascist. So for myself, I was your typical progressive, had a series of series of personal traumas occur in my life that challenged that worldview significantly. And I did live without money for like a year to kind of test what I was hearing, and discovered, you know, the collaborative wisdom market and help kind of facilitate it early on with Bevery. And now, yeah, and now I would probably say I'm like middle libertarian, like, or center libertarian. I see the left libertarian arguments as well as the right libertarian. That's probably where the majority, but again, I pick to take the issues as they come. So throughout the thing, a lot of what he wrote are things I'm sympathetic or even agree with in his factual statements. The manifesto is comprised of political claims, factual assertions, questionable associations, and then activists or what do we call it, radicalizing language. That's
Right.
probably like the 4 types of categories of the language he uses. And for his factual statements, these are things that I see a lot of truth in. And even some of his political ones, he has some great rants about capitalism that is like, Jesus, those are some doozies. That's going to be very hard to argue. Yeah.
Well,
and
it's frustrating because he is willing to like argue a lot of the things that people normally aren't going to be talking about just because they're so closely aligned with some political party or something like that. But there are real issues that need to be discussed. But I think that there's a bit of a sneaky ploy that he's making by actually bringing forward these serious arguments in his paper to make the association within the reader's mind that, oh, his resolutions will, or like he's providing like the solution to these types of problems. When I don't know, personally, like going through the calls to action that he puts forward, I'm seeing like no real relation to the actual like problems that he's laying out there. And I think there's more more formal or more more specific details that need to actually be put into play in order to actually respond to the types of problems that he brings forward in his paper than what he actually is putting forward as solutions.
Yeah. So I read it over a week, maybe like an hour a day, and as the week progressed, I was just like, I'm not sure how I can argue against this. This is really challenging because he's he's not going. It's kind of like a character development arc followed on with a very personal, anecdotal call to action. And if anyone's seen like many revenge movies like Prisoners or Irreversible, or I have a list in the actual show notes, which you can get in the description, your typical revenge movie, these are, ordinary men who a traumatic thing happens to them, like the daughter gets raped or killed, and they go for revenge. Now, if it's revenge against an individual, that's fine, but often atrocities happen by groups, and group on group revenge is the thing. It's the eye for an eye strategy. So he does present a solution, but whether or not it's a sustained solution is debatable. And that's hopefully what we're going to really sink our teeth into in this call and kind of say, like, this will work maybe, but is it something that will work in the long term? You don't want to throw your life away and throw the lives of others away if you aren't sure that this is the best way to address your concerns. And we're not saying those concerns aren't real. We're just saying there may be a better way than to than violence.
Right.
And
Like
that's
the
not
stuff that
negating
he
the value of violence either. Like
yeah.
violence is necessary in plenty of times.
Yeah, he brings up like some very strong emotional cases for why like the notion of revenge is the appropriate response to the events that have taken place. The problem is with how he's harnessing that in order to sort of establish his more extreme ideology. But I think that it's still very persuasive to a lot of people that do have that strong emotional response to the things that they've been observing. Like there's many accounts that he brings up as examples in the manifesto, and I don't think we're actually going to be like showing any of it on screen, but we'll just be sort of discussing some of the more basic points. So he's like relying upon that strong emotional connection that people are having to these events and responding with a similar sort of outflowing of that emotion into, say, revenge. Like it's a primary motivating factor for his argument. In fact, he makes a point that people are mostly motivated through emotion, and that but when you can actually like harness that emotion, that's when you can gain real political traction. And so we need to actually respond to we have these emotional responses to these events that have taken place, and actually respond to it in a smart manner that is not just going to be ultimately detrimental for ourselves into the future. Yeah.
Yeah, and even to add, as one of the talking points, because we're going to be trying to address a wide range of audience members here. So just if we're saying something that may not align with your particular worldview, be it your far right or far left, whatever, just try and bear with us that we're just trying to address all the extremities. And even if it's, because these extremities view themselves as the only sane solution to some very difficult problems. So for him, his big concern is like the survival of his people, in his words, and his people being the white people or the white race, and specifically Euro or Caucasians, right? And there may be better ways of doing that, although as why this has been quarantined, this manifesto is quarantined, distribution of it is banned in New Zealand. It's very, some of the things he argues is very difficult to confront and then to challenge, because there are also things that Black Lives Matters are protesting, like police violence, the the things the Marxists are like protesting with capitalism. He's like thrown in everything. Um, as like as John indicated, he's thrown in everything, and he's presenting
Yeah.
this as like a solution. So okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, a catch-all solution like you have in
right,
the thumbnail, the sort of like all these sort of like primary goals or values that all the different like political spectrums are trying to move towards. And so like he's sort of putting this forward as like, oh, his ethno-nationalism is sort of the primary solution to all of these individual problems that we like each of the different political spectrums are trying to find. And it's like, oh, it's the
right,
one final way that can really respond to each of these different things. And
right.
that's what he's trying to use in order to sort of bring people on board.
Right. And he also says
But
monotonous repetition of immigration facts and statistics will simply bore the masses and drive people away from the stale and uninspired speakers that propagate them. So our plan, yeah, is to jump into the character, then the summary, and then his arguments, what's terms he's using, and then what's the alternatives. All right. So what's his character? Well, he grew up in Grafton in New South Wales. It's about a few hundred kilometers north of me, and a few hundred because I'm in Sydney right now, and it's a few hundred kilometers south of Brisbane. But it's closer to Brisbane than not. It's actually a very pretty area. It's like kind of like farmland within like valleys with a river running through it. It's quite pretty. I actually went through other notable people in that area on the Wikipedia page. It was actually like a Chinese revolutionist. I think he was fighting for the good fight, whatever that was. I didn't read that much, but I thought it was interesting. But mostly it's like rugby players and other like physical labor people who kind of become famous there. There's not much to do in rural Australia. But it is very community focused. But there's also a lot of despair through Australia. Australia is a very isolated place. I grew up in Western Australia, very isolated. Uh, for instance, it's like 5,000 kilometers to the next capital city from Perth. It's a multiple day drive. It's quicker. The next closest like capital city is like, I think in another country, which is generally Bali. Um, but the Australia I grew up in was very multicultural. I had friends across all ethnicities. Um, and I never really saw an issue with it. And even in university, I always had never really saw race as a thing. Um, and none of my friends did either across different races. We all just treated each other as people. And it was only when American culture started infiltrating Australia around 2010 and onwards did race start becoming a issue. And because America has race issues and they propagate that through their massive influence in English speaking content to the rest of the world. Um, and then these issues started kind of arising up. So yeah, he grew up in nature in like a rural town. He was a personal trainer. He was an early investor in crypto, and he used to be a leftist. Yeah, traveled through Europe. I couldn't find anything reliable on him traveling outside of Europe, say to Asia. Um, I'm not sure if he did or not. It seems he just went to Europe. And during his travels, he came across many assimilation issues and local proximity to a few attacks, like terrorist attacks, such as ISIS attacks. He contrasted this with the history of Europe, such as the wars that Europeans have fought over the years, local and global wars, and wondered why no one was doing anything against these attacks and the destruction of this culture he aligned and felt pride with. That apathy and decline he saw was a flaw of democracy, and he felt he needed to act, and he aligned with fascism. Now, democracy, one of the failings of democracy is it's mob rule. It allows the mob to suppress the minority. And this is actually a great step forward from feudalism. Feudalism, the minority oppressed the majority. And then you have democracy. That's a great improvement. Now it's the majority oppressing the minority. However, there's still an inherent corruptibility in that. And he goes into several things where like democracy ends up being just like a vehicle for like crony capitalism. which we'll go into later. But he kind of used very similar language to rape victims would use, but associated with culture, which is this feeling of absolute helplessness, absolute violation, absolute despair. Um, and he aligned a lot with like a warrior archetype, like a feeling he needs to protect people. And one of the instances which radicalized him or was a catalyst was a truck in a terrorist attack ran over an ISIS terrorist attack, I reckon. Oh, I reckon that's the Australian lingo. But it seems whatever is it ran over a deaf girl who didn't hear it oncoming. And if you are in like a community area, um, you do see your empathy does reach out to those around you and those you consider part of your extended family or your community. And it's traumatizing. This is where like revenge movies come in. There's the movie Prisoners, where a daughter is kidnapped by a perceived psycho. So they kidnap and torture the psycho to try and find out where the daughter is. So there's like this call to action. And I mean, that's pretty. So that's kind of like where he's going. And then he writes this manifesto to kind of wrestle with that angst, that ideological angst, the cultural angst that he faced. So for the paper, he starts off with like an abstract or synopsis, kind of like a historical account of the things that led him to radicalization. Then like a Q&A as if it's, he's being interviewed by a journalist, because such domestic terrorists don't really get any journalist activity and the letters get cut off. Like communication gets cut off when they go to jail. So you have to, if you want to get your message out, you have to do it prior. So that's generally the Q&A thing. He kind of answered things as if he was being interviewed by a journalist, because he doesn't get that opportunity later. And then he, after the Q&A, it goes into many mini chapters. These like 1 page or 2 page longs. Now they are not in any type of grouping or order. They're just like a what do we call it?
Freeform. Yeah, sort of. Flow of thought. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just scattered throughout. So the groups of mini chapters, he's got environmentalism, which his arguments are kind of with eco-fascism. We'll go into that later. So he's got environmentalism, and then he's got his anti-system pro-strength. What's he against? What's he for? And he's against feminism, as a lot of these male domestic terrorists are. They kind of see it as a form of like paired with democracy as a way of propagating weak policy onto the nation, that then allows it to be infiltrated by strong competitors. And it also destroys the reward incentives for men. And then anti-conservatism, conversationalists, pacifists. No, conservatives are pacifist slaves to the corporate system, is his opinion on conservatism, which is kind of interesting. Anti-globalism, which is that cheap labor is slave labor, refuse to import modern slaves, which is that the drive for mass immigration or company diversity is because the amount of local talent has been exhausted. Therefore, they need to believe either if they require low-skilled labor, they don't need to believe, they just need to import and then train. If they require skilled labor, such as technology workers, then they also need to believe in a blank slate. And this is a big contention with politics right now, which is how much of one's ability is genetic or heritable versus cultural. And that is, it's like a whole can of worms that we'll go into soon. And then he's also anti-immigration. If anyone can be anything, then identity is meaningless. This is also rhetoric that is used for the gender issue. If anyone can be any gender, then what does gender mean? And also anti-democracy and anti-capitalist voting is mob rule is media rule is corporate rule, is his view. And then he follows it up with urgency. So there's a race, a population race, like which populations are growing, which populations are shrinking, which populations are risking becoming a minority, and any minority is oppressed in his worldview. So you do not want to become a minority. You want to make sure your population continues. And just like anything economic, anything that is part of a game theory, there is competitors, and those competitors can either be, you can become equal with your competitor, or you can eliminate your competitor.
Right. That's a strong sort of like repeated sort of point that he makes, is that in Western countries, most white people are not meeting the 2.1 replacement fertility rate that would be necessary for continuing.
Wait, in all, I actually
continuing
fact-checked that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in all,
what
all
do you
white,
mean at?
all predominantly white
yeah.
countries, they are not meeting the sustained reproduction rate.
Right. Now there would be like a response made by, say, like a techno-futurist or something like that, that as societies progress and make it so that there's less concern about existential threats or dangers and things like that, you're less apt to die in a well-developed society. And so that sort of level, or that layer of requirement, and with the increase in the average lifespan, that 2.1 level isn't as necessary. But I still think his point still sort of stands, that when there is sort of this competition taking place on a genetic level, I suppose, between most Western white countries that are not meeting this even like median threshold of replacement, replacement for the white people that are dying off, and then being new white people being born, versus, say, other cultures, immigrant cultures that are coming into the Western countries like New Zealand, Australia, Europe, and United States. That is what is his primary concerns for this, especially it seems like especially Muslim, the Muslim fertility rate is much higher than the Western European fertility rate that's occurring.
Right. There's a movie, Cloud Atlas, which is phenomenal. It's actually a movie that actually has a theme of a counter argument to this manifesto in it. But at the same time, it does have a give. And one of those gives is it has many different timelines, 6 different timelines, if I recall correctly, like past, present, future. The one that is set like 300 years in the future, or maybe it's longer, 1,000 or something like that. Everyone looked like this, which is like an amalgamation of like all the different ethnicities. With Brenton, he would consider that to be undignified of the heritage of European culture and what they've stood for and maintained and sustained for thousands of years. That's his.
And he has a bit of rhetoric to support that as well, with like what is the value of a rainbow that has multiple different colors, but when you mix all those colors together, then you're left with just sort of this ugly mess. And so if one of our values is like our cultural heritage is important, and other cultures are important as well, then there needs to be some sort of diversity of culture that is able to withstand time. And so that's why his argument he's making for having some sort of separation and I guess a balance, or a competition taking place between Western culture and, say, Middle Eastern culture that's going on. To me, the response that I like originally had to it was just seemed like this naive sort of response to just the difference in fertility rates, where if it's the case that any culture that is currently in the minority regarding fertility rates has a legitimate grievance against those that are populating at a faster rate, to the point that they have full right to stage an all-out attack on those of the majority status. Like, what kind of a country is he trying to build here if that's his like resolution to a mere difference in how many people are having as many babies as they are? And it just seems like a completely, like, I'm coming at this from a more like right-wing sort of temperament, and like I want a stable society to live within, that so that I can raise my children within. But if I'm like, if I'm raising a society in which like any minority group value that's within the majority group value has full right and is justified in attacking the majority group, well, that's not a nation I don't want to raise my children in. And it's I don't think he's thinking this.
Well,
I'll try not to go as far out on his character, but
to just get at what I think you were wrestling with is in some of my research I found that a quote on one of the Wikipedia pages or something like that, not about tangentially about Nazis in general, and it was something like, well, Nazi is nationalist socialist, and it was a combination of right-leaning culture mixed with left politics. And I think for him, he went, his way here is the same. It's a right-leaning culture. He really likes that culture of strength and community and hierarchy and where you fit in and belonging to an extent and whatnot. But at the same time, it's a left-leaning, my brain just reset. I'm quite deprived.
Like wants that autonomy,
right?
Yeah,
more anarchical,
self-governing.
So like for someone who is unfamiliar, there's left libertarian and right libertarian. Right libertarian is like your Wall Street capitalists, and left libertarian is like your
hippie compound.
Chomsky may even be put in it. But there's an array of them, but it's more like now hippie commune would be a more anarchical. But no, left libertarian, the best example of him, of left libertarian would be Cody Wilson. Cody Wilson is the guy behind Defense Distributed, 3D printed guns, and so left libertarianism is concerned with monopolistic systems, like freedom when it comes to systems, when right libertarian is like freedom when it comes to individuals. So left libertarian is like, how can we prevent corrupt monopolistic systems, kind of thing. So Cody Wilson, he studied the left philosophers, and he came to the conclusion, well, while guns are owned by sanctioned businesses, then negative incentives will continue their propagation, and tyranny will ensue to decentralized threats. Therefore, the only way to guarantee freedom is to allow everyone to have a gun, which fixes the capitalistic problematic incentives, which is increased terror means increased gun purchases, which is increased profits. But if you make it a bloody ocean in business terminology, which is high competition, then the profits go away and there's less benefit from negative incentives. So because anyone could print it, and then you actually, by having everyone have a gun, then the cost of aggression greatly increases where it may not be worth it. So very interesting ways to go about it. So,
and I want to clarify, in his manifesto, he brings up like a response or other justifications for why the actions against, say, Muslims having a larger birth rate are mostly due to cultural incompatibilities that are taking place, which you can read, say, Douglas Murray's The Strange Death of Europe as a prime example of many of those types of cultural clashes that would be taking place between a Western European mindset and a Middle Eastern sort of Muslim mindset. And then the other sort of point that he would make is that there is some sort of semblance of like property in regards to land. So like Europe is for Europeans, and that's the case for like, so anyone immigrating into Europe is now not part, has no claim to this land, and so the Europeans get a full right to defend themselves even when they are being oppressed by the majority, say, of Muslims or something like that.
I
I
missed
don't
the connection there.
particularly.
Why is Europe the property of Europeans?
I feel somewhat the same, just because most countries are taken through force of some sort. So like there's no real clear distinguishing fact. Like he's Australian himself, which is like taken by the Aborigines. So like by his logic, the Aborigines, seeing that they're becoming a minority within Australia, have full right and full justification for taking violent action against the Australians because of this oppression that is taking forth. And maybe like he wants to bite that bullet, but to me that seems obviously just a stirring of anarchy and chaos, which is as somebody with a more temperament towards law and order, this is just automatically like going up against my sensibilities.
Yeah. In other words, this guy's too anarchist for John. John would be a better fascist.
Yes, exactly. I could set things up in order now. but I'm saying that because I think that a lot of people on the further right, similar, like I share some temperaments to them. I just don't usually express them as much as people on the internet tend to. But I think that that's a legitimate sort of temperament difference between, say, the Christchurch shooter and most people on the right that actually do want to foster a secure existence for their children. And like this avenue that the Christchurch shooter has taken on is just obviously not the way if we're going to hold some sort of semblance of order for sustained reliability.
Well, not necessarily from his view, and his view is because the solution will rise from the ashes. And his thing was kind of like a radical nihilist at the end, or like the jokester or Joker character, where it's just like, let's just see the world burn, and the victorious, the strong, which is like this line of like this subtle line of supremacy running through will come out. And it is hard for the Australian-New Zealand bit. This is part of it. He deliberately mentioned, because it's hard to go into the arguments, and I think we have more detailed notes further into that. But it's part of the why target New Zealand, and he specifically stated it is to show it's a global issue and to get more global interest. I think from what he's communicated, his inherent view would be that, the Aboriginals should fight, the Maoris in New Zealand should fight, and we will let the victorious win. That seems to be his thing. But at least his most ethno-nationalism, it just specifically applies to Europe. I think everything else is just like tangential gasoline on the fire of reclaiming Europe. That seems to be like his thing, where it's just like, let's get the world burning as quickly as possible so we can reclaim Europe.
And so even on that point, I think that he's like hitching his wagon to the wrong horse, because given all the evidence that's out there, like there are financial incentives.
Right, John, we'll go into the actual bit. So yeah, he's got these things about urgency, so population race, which is dwindling white populations, bursting other populations. The other populations, again, it's like a population warfare versus assimilation. In Australia, there is actually, compared to the US, there is a large political and cultural what would you call it? Not momentum, but like feeling zeitgeist towards assimilation. So for instance, for someone to become an Australian citizen, they do a values test, and that values test they could always fake it or whatever. I assume it's more diligent where it's harder to fake, but there's certain things to kind of make sure that they actually do align with the culture and they're not just like a jihadist. However, that, and to some extent is maybe it's not as, I haven't looked in the data, but Australia has worked pretty well on our multiculturalism compared to the USA. It never was an issue until USA started incorporating their culture. There obviously we had cultural issues, but it wasn't like the forefront everyday fear that it was. Now certainly some communities, but it wasn't like let's have riots all across America as what's happening in the US, or like where these USA concepts are like every day. So the idea is that he presents is say Muslim or other groups, especially like say Chinese is another group. They will tend to have their own towns, their own communities, and they rarely assimilate. And his thing was, well, why don't they assimilate? Why don't they crossbreed? I'm not sure he actually said that, but for assimilating culturally, well, he posits it, and it's like, well, why would anyone assimilate into a decaying culture? And this is very much in evidenced by probably a lot of mainstream media content and feelings, especially in the youth. And has continued on from the Beat generation, like the Generation X's, like their whole nihilism and angst has become the media playground of today, of which the millennials are being indoctrinated into, which is hard, like where it's just like, hey, hedonism is the only thing worth chasing. It's unfulfilling. Take antidepressants, whatever. So that's kind of the argument. Like the Western culture is decaying. That's why it's okay to hate it. It's fine to kick the loser. It's fine to kick the person on the ground. You're not going to get bullied for it. So that's part of it. All right. And minority group suppression. So you don't want to be a minority. They get oppressed. So you want to make sure you maintain your competitive advantage. What is going to happen in white culture when the boomers die? This is interesting. What happens when the parents of our generation, Y generation, die? From numbers as well as from culture, this is a dramatic shift. It's an interesting question. Now, he also posits a sense of urgency. You will die, you will be forgotten, make it meaningful. And this is interesting. Like we maybe remember like 1 out of a million people in society, maybe less, 1 out of a billion people. But the thing is, if you have a child, you now create a lineage that lasts thousands of years. If you get grandchildren, you're pretty set. Your genetic contributions will continue on forever. Which is your legacy will continue on forever. And that's a very compelling argument for people who are, say, facing infertility issues. A lot of people, they face infertility, they go down, I'm going to have legacy through my work. That is a very, very tricky argument. That would be like a whole nother talk, like an infertility session or call.
Well, there's sort of two things at play here, because you can have like a genetic heir that's like 100 years past you, and there's no real bearing or relationship between your heir and yourself, because like they've completely adopted a new sort of ideology. And then there's the people that aren't able to like have genetic heirs, and so for them to provide some sort of mimetic heirs, right, with their work, they are providing some aspect of shared commonality between who they are, what they thought, what their values were, and the people that continue on past them. And so that's why, like, if you're at all interested in this type of thing, you want to have some share of the both, where you can have people that are like you, have some sort of physical connection to who you are, because we are like physical beings. And then also having some sort of commonality between like the way that you thought and the values that you had, and between now and your heir into the future. But of course, like a lot of people nowadays, like in the West, aren't really interested in that at all. They're just trying to live the best life now, basically.
Yeah, well, another difficulty is that there's the cultural tool of shame right now, which is to call such sacrifice of lineage cucking. Um, when you are now utilizing your resources to continue the progenation of other men. And that is one hell of an insult. So
I mean, not
it's
as much anymore. It seems like cuck is only an insult for people on the right. Now it's sort of like a badge of honor
right.
that people on the left will wear, which is
Yeah. If you're on the right, it's it's one hell of an insult. But yeah, it's anyway, that could be its own call in of itself, and it's tangential to his overall point. And then finally, for the urgency, or actually to go into, then the last part is kind of like a call to action. So for instance, he says like the means don't matter if you win. That seems a factually true statement, more or less. And the point is that no matter what happens, people will hate the winners. So you might as well just win. So
well, he was kind of making the case that the whoever wins it gets to write the history, and so like don't worry about like being called racist or anything like that, because if you win, then there's nobody left to really call you a racist, which is a similar. It's funnily enough a similar ideology to those on the far left as well, because like there's these two sorts of points within the far left of like history is written by the victors, and you want to be on the right side of history, which when you put both of those two things together, all it means is I want to be with the winners. And that's like that's the power play between both the far right and the far left that is common to both of them.
Right. Yeah. For nuggets like that, follow John Wright on Twitter, Writer John Buck. I saw that on your Twitter. I was like, man, that's a good one.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, and then he's got a bit of like kind of like how Hitler or like orators like Martin Luther King kind of inspire people. And his thing was more or less like, if it feels right, do it. If it's impulsive, do it. Like if you vibe with it, you know it's right. Like you feel it in your bones. And I mean, that works for a lot of people. So, and then other people, it just leads them to drugs. And like, what's that movie with like Jared Leto that made him famous, Requiem for a Dream? Other people, it leads you to that. All right. But yeah, and then a warrior identity, be the change you want to see in the world. Without overwhelming effort and extreme risk, expect nothing. This is just like personal development 101, business 101, like Gandhi 101.
Yeah, he definitely sort of like relies upon that sort of like deep innate desire within men to be men and actually live meaningful lives, and like don't like be a cowardice pussy all your life and actually do something. And he's really like trying to foster that within the reader somewhat effectively, I guess.
Yeah, and then,
I mean, so really anything that sort of puts forward that it is able to latch onto the readers, especially within the West. Like, funnily enough, there's a lot of converts from within Western nations towards Islam and radical extreme Islam as well, just because of the fact that there's a deep sense of community and there's a deep sense of meaning and forward goal and momentum that is there within the far extreme Islamic identity that's there, that most or a lot of young men like people like me or whatever aren't getting in the sort of secular Western sort of culture that's out there.
This is fantastic. So this is like Kaczynski, the Unabomber Manifesto. We covered that last week. His was it power process, right? But in the Milton's hierarchies, one of them is like significance. And in significance, there was a personal development conference I attended when I was like a teenager, which I attribute to a lot of my success. But part of it, one of the examples the orator gave was, why do people commit like massacres or shootings or whatever it is, right? And it's because within a moment, they become the most significant thing in the world to the victim. Like, so if you've just been told you're useless and you're insignificant your entire life, putting a gun to someone's head makes you instantly the most significant thing in the world to someone.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Like a lot of these types of people, they have this feeling like they don't exist. All they are is this small, insignificant speck in this giant conglomeration of a society that doesn't, like, nothing you do in this society really matters because everything's can sort of like self-correct or something like that. And so when you have that sort of instance where you can be like you can be the deciding factor in a life and a death, that is a strong amount of significance that could play a part in a person's motivation.
Right. It's also something that I would imagine also drives the psychological despair farmers face when the yields go or drought strikes, things like that, because before they were significant, they were feeding the nation. They sustained the nation's body. And when a drought happens, how do they get out of that? They're just a farmer. Suicide rates among rural towns is incredibly high. In Australia, there is a very large meth issue. Any country town you go to the toilet, there is like meth, like, lifeline or meth, phone numbers and things like that. So that's a really interesting point. And then so he's the last bit, joined the movement appeals to others. I can't remember what I meant by that. Run towards the cities, exacerbate the decay, rise from the ashes. And essentially, maybe that's like a line of supremacy or just nihilism or just angst and just despair to act now, running through. But it's hard for that. So to wrap it up, and a lot of these things where I was researching it, the ethno-nationalists or like the right fascist movement or whatever, or the fascist movement, the modern fascist movement, I should say, is kind of utilizing or desiring to utilize the same means and is vibrato a word? Like libido?
Like,
Yeah,
like
libido is probably good. Like
libido,
that's like
it seems like
libido.
you're just
Yeah,
like the vernacular or like their drive, the
yeah,
impetus, their
yeah. Drive. Yeah.
okay.
Which it kind of embodied by libido as well, like the
Yeah,
libido of ISIS, right? There's a
gotcha.
brilliant documentary of called City of Ghosts. There's many movies called that. It's the one about ISIS, and it looks into like the conquest of Raqqa by ISIS, and it is vicious. It is one hell of a thing. And I followed up with a documentary about a Australian who radicalized, as well as about defectors from ISIS, as well. And it is one hell of a movement to contend with. Like their media and propaganda department is like prime time. It's really something. They like you have like an area, like a sizable area of the world that is incredibly hostile, that recruits members from all over the world to just like take over cities and tyrannize them. Like that is a force. And that's kind of what the ethno-nationalists are wanting to do. They're like sick of conservatism. They think of being told lay over while we kick you. And now they're like, hey, why don't we kind of radicalize, and like ISIS is our enemy. What they're doing is working. Why don't we be like them? And that's kind of like the whole thesis or like of what he is doing. Like, why don't we be like our enemy? They're winning. We're not. Their techniques work. Ours aren't. We should be like them. And it's the inherent issue with that is it's an eye for an eye ideology, and you're hedging your life, you're hedging the lives of your victims on the idea of an eye for an eye ideology. That is a very weak way to proceed, because it is a repetitive way to proceed. It is not innovative. Something that is innovative breaks the cycle, and that does not break the cycle. It continues it. It will always result in tribes fighting tribes. And it's not to say that we can't, like, there's other things we can do to kind of mend that issue. And one of the flaws, right, is that we'll get into is my brain's just reset again. fight for and fight. All right, we'll jump into that. I've got notes. So let's go into the terminology, right? Because this was Brenton, like, he was like, I'm for diversity. I want cultures to remain distinct. I don't want them to amass together. That's interesting, right? Like a white supremacist or nationalist for it. So was he a white supremacist, a white nationalist, an ethno-nationalist, a combination? What's the difference between them? What were his terms? How does he qualify them? Well, he self-describes as an eco-fascist. His ideology is ethno-nationalist, and it's informed by an ethnogenetic culture. So same thing, kind of somewhat influenced Nazi Germany, depending on what information you're using to inform your opinion of Nazi Germany. But there is the idea that was very popular until World War II, that your genes influenced your personality, that influences your culture. And also your environment influences your genes, which then influences your behavior and your culture. And it's like a big circle between behavior, genes, culture, and they're all influencing each other, and environment, right? Yeah. Genes, environment, culture. Yeah, they're all influencing each other. And to some extent, that's true. On face value, it's true. And in certain depths of analysis, that remains very true. So for instance, for personality, I was doing research for this. Yeah, personality is genetic, highly genetic. Now, there is environmental cues that will move it along in different directions over life. However, identical twins raised in different, completely culturally different things tend to be more similar personality-wise than not. And there is other research like in terms of, well, why is that the case? Well, certain hormones facilitates different personalities. This is why you have a personality disorder or depression or anxiety or something, you take some drugs to change your hormones. It changes your behavior. So some people, as well as like the idea of clairvoyance, apparently they have a bit more DMT in their brain being released naturally. DMT is the psychedelic that is released when we are dreaming. But for other people, maybe they have higher oxytocin, higher dopamine, higher cortisol, higher, what's another one? There's another one. But yeah, there's different hormones that could be influencing. There's a lot of research on this. I did find a link. It'll be in the show notes in the description below. It is a huge Wikipedia document that goes into it. But the contention here between the modern ethno-nationalist usage of that is whether it's causation or correlation. There is definitely some causation, but then again, it's hard to draw, well, does that causation go out into culture and things like that? And we covered certain things like group selection theory is fairly new, like 20 years new, where it's become like a formal theory that can be wrestled and contended with. And it's one hell of a theory. So for instance, like suicide, why does suicide exist? Well, suicide can detract resources from the useless by driving the significance down, so they eject themselves to then put resources in a scarce environment towards those who are still fit. Or say, for instance, psychopathy, psychopathy, depending on your accent. Why does that exist? Well, the idea is it strengthens the group by having the enemy internally. You now build immunity to those type of exploits because you're forced to, which is a lot less, it decreases your vulnerability to foreign invaders who would use the same exploit. Because when it's a few psychopaths internally, like 1 out of 1,000 or whatever, then you have to fix it before the army of bad guys eradicates you.
In Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, he makes the case with hawks and doves, where if you have doves, which are primarily utilizing a very reciprocal sort of altruistic behaviors, then as soon as one hawk comes in, they're going to exploit all the doves and take in all that. So that's really interesting. The theory of psychopathy as sort of a mutation or aberration within the dove group, so as to fortify it against that sort of behavior from outside coming in. That's
Right.
really fascinating.
Yeah, because the thing with like suicide is it doesn't seem like that should be something that is typically passed down genetically, because if you kill yourself, how do you reproduce? Right. So there seems to be certain traits that then makes people susceptible to things that promote group selection. Now, this is like a new area of research, but again, that's very different from ethical questions of eugenics or ethical questions of genocide, right? And that's to draw like a leap to genocide or eugenics. You can do it, but it's still a leap. And maybe it's a fair leap, but who knows? And this is like the contention. These are questions, which is also why we're doing this, that aren't being addressed. Instead, you sympathize or you question it, you're out of the conversation pool. That does not help people. What helps people is doing research, finding answers, becoming a social scientist, trying to get the answers to this. That helps. So, like shooting people up based on some pseudoscience when you haven't tested it is not a good idea, or eugenics or whatever other left or right tactic there. So what's the counter to that one? Well, the counter to that one is uh, uh, well, the typical counter that like the left-leaning media personalities will say is, well, and it's a fair point, which is the only way we will know that it is purely genetic is if we solve all the environmental and social factors first. And this is like intelligence difference, right? So intelligence is it's factual to say Africans have a lower intelligence than Americans, like
On average.
which is, yeah, on average, right? Which is like the bell curve argument or something. But the cause for that, is it genetic or is it nutritional? Nutrition actually plays one hell of a role. You take a white person, gives them bad nutrition, they're going to be as thick as a brick. um, so, so what we can do is solve the nutrition thing first. And we see things where even Thomas Jefferson, when I was researching this on one of the links that will be in the show notes, Thomas Jefferson kind of described the black entity, their traits as if doing something anthropological. But then he came across like a brilliant mathematician who was black, and he had to revise, and he was just like, oh, this is great. And Thomas Sowell or Barack Obama, these are like great instances or inspiring instances of this. Well, wait, if Thomas Sowell can be like one of the best economists in the world of incredible intelligence, then what does that have to say about my theory that blacks are stupid genetically? So it kind of takes that out and then says, well, there's other causal factors and we should maybe address those causal. But that is still a sidestep from the other arguments about cultural warfare. That's just one about genetic influence and causations, right?
Yeah, that was something I wanted to bring up, because it seems like a lot, like most of this paper hinges upon the premise that Muslim cultures and Western European cultures are inherently incompatible with one another. And there's some like good arguments that can be made for that reason. Like with Sam Harris, he has the End of Faith, which largely has that at least to do with like Muslim religiosity, not necessarily just Middle Eastern culture in general, though it's hard to really figure out where the disconnect is between those two ideas are. I think that there's something kind of missing here, because we can have relevant data that shows where they're certainly working compatibly with one another in certain other regions besides Europe, such as like within Canada, there's a seemingly, now I'm not Canadian, so I'm speaking, I guess, from whatever Canadian propaganda is out there that's enlightening me. The ability for Muslim cultures and Western, perfectly Canadian cultures to coexist with one another. And I'm thinking the I guess key point of difference or distinction is where aren't resources abundant enough so that there is no need for competition to be taking place. Because that's the thing, when there's competition, you're always going to have some sort of in-group preference. Like, okay, there's not enough for all of us, so I'm only going to support my own. But if it's the case that the problem with Muslim and European confrontations taking place is primarily due to resources scarcity, then the Christchurch shooters sort of thesis about there being some inherent incompatibility between these ideas is not as inherent as he's trying to make the case out to be. Now, it's still a problem because, like, if there are these resource scarcities taking place, then there is still going to be conflict. But it's not something as drastic that we need to turn towards as of yet, when there are other means of actually responding to this sort of problem.
Right, and we'll go into that. So in the like R's, feels, reals, and what can be done about it part. So the reasoning of raising again the ethnogenetic culture part is he puts like eco-fascist as the superset and
Eco-fascists.
Eco-fascist.
Yeah.
And then underneath it is ethno-nationalist. So he says you can't be an ethno-national, or you can't be an eco-fascist or an environmentalist without also being an ethno-nationalist. His arguments for that are in the book. I think they're somewhat, is the word spurious, like kind of like, I don't know, tangentially linked, because there's many things of, I mean, to some extent it's true. Okay.
There's definitely, it seems like a commonality, at least, with most eco-fascists being ethno-nationalists in a sort of sense. But you can have left-wing eco-fascists that I wouldn't think are ethno-nationalists at all.
Okay, yeah. So,
the fact that you recognize that, if these devices are left to their own, will damage the environment, you can take that position from a left-wing perspective easy enough.
Right.
And so, like, with the eco-fascism being like, there needs to be some sort of authoritarian positioning to make sure that the environment isn't being impinged upon.
Right. Yeah. So I found a quote, and he says, okay, well, why focus on immigration birth rates when climate change is such an issue? Because they are the same issue. The environment is being destroyed by overpopulation.
I see.
We Europeans are one of the groups that are not overpopulating the world. The invaders are the ones overpopulating the world. Kill the invaders, kill the overpopulation, and by doing so, save the environment. So that's there's other ways to save the environment. Elon Musk is like a good example of that. And the other ways is you kind of do what China is attempting to do. Like anytime you bring prosperity to the world, conspicuous consumption increases. For instance, like meat used to be a very rare commodity, but as wealth goes up, meat consumption goes up. Meat is a lot more devastating to the environment than rice or your carbs, right? So what you then need to do is you need to pair wealth with environmental friendly options, which is what Musk is focused on. How can we create carbon neutral alternatives or whatever it is for the wealthy, and then through economic scale, bring that at a lower cost to everybody, which is kind of like the technological utopia, the idea that we can eventually build free energy for everyone. However, this is the way with anything. The initial innovation or the initial progress, there's always a burst of progress, and then there's the consequences of that progress, and then we build another thing. This is why Kaczynski kind of just said, I'm a Luddite kind of thing, like do away with this endless drive of technology because it's damaging the environment. Well, the thing is, the counter argument to that, as I went into in the last thing, is, well, it doesn't solve environmental threats such as asteroids, volcanoes, earthquakes, cyclones, things like that. Now, earthquakes and cyclones, the ones local to Earth, yeah, climate change does influence that. Asteroids, no, climate change can be a big thing. Asteroids can still wipe us out, or a star blowing up. Star blowing up, we can't ever do something about that. Because that'll destroy the whole galaxy. But if an asteroid's heading towards Earth, then being spacefaring, being in Mars, is one hell of a good step. Ayn Rand goes more into this idea, which is nature is there to serve us. And she makes quite a compelling case in The Fountainhead for this.
You could maybe make a case that given the right I guess, systems put into place. You could have a sort of Kaczynskiite um, uh, village or whatever that could build up enough resources to uh, effectively prevent a asteroid system taking place. Because all he was fine with certain amounts of technology, only the types of technology that would require some sort of like broader systemic sort of imposition upon the rest of the environment, it's like having factories and things like that. But and if you had some sort of like space program that was entirely locally based, while still it would still require factories and things like that. But if it was all based within, say,
No.
Texas
But
or something like
he
that.
was specifically against technology that was post-industrial or industrial and post, right? I don't think you can build rocket ships while doing away with industrialization.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm sure he probably would just bite the bullet and say like, okay, we're gonna die as a species eventually, anyways. If it's through an asteroid, that's like what, 1 in a billion chance, 1 in a million chance, whatever.
Right.
I mean, that's a much better way than to live in misery with under some sort of technocracy.
Right. Yeah. So that would be interesting because that's like a terror that keeps Musk and many people up at night. Right. Like, what if an asteroid hits? But then his answer would be, so what?
Right? Yeah, like, I know. And so, that's
but that was like, my response to him on many things. I was just like, so what? Like,
so myself being a little bit more sympathetic towards Kaczynski's points that he's making, I think there could be some sort of adequate response that is still like provides us eventually with some sort of space program or something like that, so long as it's not relying upon this sort of like industrialization of the human spirit, something like that could maybe take place if it was all done within some sort of localized community. I mean, like you can have an entire Amish village raise a barn. I mean, given enough time and resources, you can maybe have a similar type of Amish or at least localized community build some sort of rocket ship or something like that.
Right. I didn't get that interpretation, but we can contend about that.
Yeah.
Offline or whatever.
Right.
But,
the point though that you were making about the what was it? Oh, the eco-fascism. When I was first reading through the manifesto, it first seemed like almost an explicit contradiction with his writings, in that he was saying that the Muslims have too high of a birth rate. They're populating to such a high degree. What we need to be doing is have the white race populating to a higher degree than we are currently, and to sort of beat out the Muslims, or at least be in a competitive chance. And then later in the paper, he starts espousing his eco-fascistic ideology. And in that, he's saying that when there's overpopulation, that's damaging to the environment. And so because the Muslims are overpopulating, that's bad for the environment.
Why he had the preference of killing instead of breeding. Because I had a big question mark on that in the thing, right? Like, why doesn't he just promote white breeding? And if overpopulation is the issue, you actually want to keep the white population at the same level. You just want to eliminate the alternatives.
And also the other point he made is that like white breeding is sort of a later concern. What you need to do is sort of eradicate the enemy within the domain first, so that there's the safety in order to raise a child in this world, something like that. But the problem with
but that's also very similar to, because there's this theme of that environmental urgency. Like, we need to act now. Like, many people have cited the 2050 end of the world climate change figure, right? Greta Thunberg.
No, it's by 2012, actually. Don't you know?
Yeah. And then you have like Greta Thunberg, which is like, how did you condemn your children to pick up your issues? But at the same time, I watch that and I find, well, that's a child struggling to realize that her parents are not God. And also I realized more recently, watching more and more Asian content is, and dealing more and more with Asians over the years, is that it's actually always been the case that people breed to solve the issues of their generation. Like throughout history, like
Mhm.
you have a farmer, you will starve unless you have children. Make more children. Like
Mhm.
whatever tribe it is, you always have children to solve the issues and protect the family and continue the family. Like that's just the lineage of the human plight. Life sucks. Make it better for the next generation while having your generation survive. That's always been the case.
Yeah.
But now there's like this sense of entitlement, like because you didn't lay things out perfectly, I'm not comfortable. It's your fault. Uh, so it's
Yeah,
kind of
and it's
like,
interesting because there's such, like, as he brings up in the manifesto, but even despite that, there's uh, less of an interest in a lot of people our ages interested even in having children, or having children at such a late age that they have a much less amount than they would back 50 years ago or something like that, where you might have
right,
5 kids to a family. Now you'll have maybe two. It's
right.
yeah. The point though that I was while what first seemed like a explicit contradiction, that like, oh, you're saying that white people need to breed more so that they're contending against the Muslims, but also Muslims need to not breed as much because that's an environmental concern. Well, like, is breeding good or bad? Because he's
Right.
got sort of these two conflicting values. Plus, there's also the other like thing that what people born in Western countries are going to have a much grander environmental impact than people within like Middle Eastern
Right.
countries.
Yeah, this is the
Our way of
conspicuous
lifestyle,
consumption.
yeah, our way of
Yeah.
lifestyle is much more of an environmental concern than somebody that is living within a very small localized community in a tightly knit, like five
Right.
five people all within one household, rather than like what uh, each individual sort of living in their own apartment, driving their own car. It's like he's that's why
Yeah.
I don't find a deep amount of
Well,
seriousness in this
well,
paper.
that's yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's probably why Kaczynski went that route, right? Like that's the Kaczynski argument. I don't want to give that much time to
Okay.
Kaczynski's arguments, because and but also for that, if someone wants to go into that, we've actually talked about that in our video, the libertarian case for veganism,
Mhm.
which is that one of the challenges for veganism again is if you're believing in minimizing animal cruelty. You will actually minimize less if you go join the Papuans or the Mongolian
Mhm.
nomads, which actually actively engage with animal cruelty, but it's less cruelty overall. So you need to rectify your perception of veganism to incorporate that. It's very challenging. I go into it in depth in that talk.
Mhm.
But it's similar to this, which is I think maybe his case is why people just need to sustain. They don't need to go above that sustenance.
Yeah.
But we could probably say, well, that's why you went killing instead of breeding. All right. So the final part of terminology is, a nationalist or a supremacist? This is hard because Australia and New Zealand are not white homelands. Homelands. Is this the natural pecking order that he promotes, or is it a supremacy? We can draw that correlation. However, he never correlated. Was a focus on Australia and New Zealand for just increased publicity and instability? Well, it seems to be the latter. That's what he explicitly stated. So moving on into, well, what are his fears real? We did cover this a lot. I just want to go through the questions so far. So what data and experiences did he use to inform his beliefs and actions? Why did he consider his beliefs fair to the data? Are his beliefs fair? Are his beliefs the only avenue of conclusion? So he has some previous left leanings, anti-capitalist, and it seems to have directed his catalyst, that traumatic experiences he had in Europe, this cultural rape he ascertains, to so he seems to have directed his initiative towards fascism instead of, say, libertarianism or anarchy. So libertarian and anarchy, they're also, and fascism, they're all counter arguments to democracy, like to try and pick up of the failures of democracy. Now, anarchism is something we've practiced many times before. Libertarianism is actually something pretty new. Libertarianism does seem to be quite new of a thing. Maybe it's a successor to democracy. However, at the same time, you won't, because of the incentives at play in democracy, it will never be voted in. Because as soon as Frederick Baster wrote in the book The Law, as soon as a government becomes philanthropic, now there is uh, perverse incentives or snowballing incentives to promise people what they want, and it caused group versus group contention, because now it's that, that group can vote for something that harms me, therefore I need to vote to make sure my group is protected. Where if you have a constitution that maintains liberty, then it destroys the ability of a monopolistic force of oppressing different groups. Instead, it is always group versus group battle rather than the mob versus group battle. So that's another thing. We can go into that in libertarianism, but I think we've covered his fears quite in detail. There is a lot of experiences and data he is citing. I think to some extent they are fair, but is it the only avenue of conclusion? And this is where his conclusion was a eye for an eye ideology. Now, so what was his goal? Has he achieved it? So his goal specifically was increased political instability by, quote, civil war in the so-called melting pot, that is the United States, should be a major aim in overthrowing the global power structure and the West's egalitarian, individualist, globalist dominant culture. Now, he was also, another instance of this increased political instability was gun owners versus gun takers by, quote, yes, that is the plan all along. You said you would fight to protect your rights in the Constitution. Well, soon that time will come. The gun owners of New Zealand are a beaten, miserable bunch of baby boomers who have long since given up the fight. When was the last time they won increased rights? Their loss was inevitable. I just accelerated things a bit. Very much towards the end, he's just calling for like, bring everything to the ashes, put up things to like promote ISIS in the universities, just do whatever can be done to cause mayhem and bloodshed and anarchy so that it will drive the white people to act, that will then drive whites to win. That's pretty much the summary of his thesis. Did he achieve it? He actually inspired many different killers after this. One guy actually killed his stepsister of 17 years because she was Asian. That is one hell of a conviction and also one hell of a tragedy. I can't imagine doing that, but that's like, that's something. So what's the alternative solutions to this? And are they suitable or unsuitable to address his fears? Just speaking to the last point, I think one of the reasons that really affects me and tears me up is some of the initial contention people are going to have to this. I don't have this actually in my notes right now. Let me pull it up on the discourse link. It'll be in the link below. It was a series of questions that we devised. Actually, I sent it to you first. Okay, so for instance, if you're encountering this ideology, initially you live in Australia, or USA, or whatever it is, your probably first reaction is going to be, but my friends are of all different races. Are they the enemy? And one of the things is like, you can still trade with your enemies. So for instance, being friends with a Muslim doesn't solve their religion. It just means you're trading with a Muslim. So Brenton would then ascertain, well, it doesn't solve the issue. It's just propagating. So then what's the step for someone who is sympathetic to these views? Well, and there's actually an answer to that, but so what's the next bit? Well,
so just to clarify, like if somebody has sort of like taken a hold of these sorts of views and do see Muslims as their enemy, and then they have some sort of close personal relationship or know somebody with a close personal relationship within a Muslim, we're trying to make the case that they need not turn violently towards them, because you can still have these sorts of interactional relationships, even if on some sort of like ideological or political scale, you might think that they're your enemy. You can still have. I'm not sure exactly what the point you were making there.
Yeah. So, but it's good you raised that because you actually introed the note. Because I read the note and I was like, how does that tie together? But you just beautifully tied it
Okay.
together. So before this, there's actually a brilliant movie called Network. It was made in 1976. It's about a news anchor who kind of believes that the world, like the job of the news people, is just to disseminate FUD and kind of keep people always in the state of terror. And then he's like, I'm fed up with this. Like, we should be mad as hell. And as actually, I'm gonna spoil the movie because I have to spoil the movie to communicate it as the solution to this issue. So around the 70s, there was actually a few news anchors who uh, became disenfranchised by their position. There was a lady who also killed herself on air. There is no footage of it online. Don't bother searching it. It's in an archive in some vault somewhere. Um, but the movie starts off kind of under that um, theme, and the man announces, I'm just going to give you what you want. The news is all about fear and like FUD, whatever. I can't fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and they kind of keep you all like on a drip. And I've had enough. I'm just going to give you what I want. I'll kill myself next week on air. And then this promotes like a serious amount of cognitive dissonance in the character, and he resolves this with a epiphany, like a communication from a high being, a tap into the ether that resolves. And that happens a lot with people who have severe cognitive dissonance. They find a connection to something higher. Conversations with God is a great series about such a thing, book series. And he has this epiphany that, hey, we should revolt. Why should I suicide? I should revolt. That's actually a quote by Patch Adams. Why suicide when you can revolt? And he decides then to go on air, and he's like, why are we taking this? Why are we being docile? We should be mad as hell. And the news anchors are like, get him off air. This is bad. We need to get him off air immediately. But then the viewership goes way higher. So then all the capitalists are like, hey, let's keep him on air. He's earning the money. He's giving people what they want. This is different. It's actually something that can put our network ahead. And anyway, it continues a lot. But then as the movie progresses, you see like the role of capitalism bridging these different borders, bridging these different cultures or identities and things. There's, for instance, like a Black Communist Party, the Black Panthers, and they get some time on the TV network or whatever it is for whatever reason I can't remember. But it's like even they succumb to the tentacles of capitalism to the end, to spread their message and whatever it is. So it's kind of interesting. But then towards the end, he starts kind of now this momentum has kind of turned into rioting, and now the capitalists are getting concerned, so they decide to quell it. And there's a brilliant speech. It's on YouTube called "The World is a Corporation." This is like, it's one of the greatest speeches I've ever heard. It's up there with like the Fountainhead speech or the Charlie Chaplin speech in The Great Dictator. It's one of the greats. And the man is just like, capitalism is the God that transcends all boundaries, all borders, all ethnicities, all religions. It liberates everyone through consensual trade. And so this is actually the threat that he has communicated, which is, well, you can still trade with your enemies, so you need to kill your enemies. Well, not necessarily. That can actually be a good thing. It means, so the thing is, well, is capitalism actually going to be inspiring, right? Is it going to be something that stops people from raging in the streets? Is it going to be something that quells the discontent? Is it going to be something that actually solves the issues? And can it also solve the issue of ideological revenge? If your daughter has been raped or, a family member killed in one of these domestic terrorist attacks, let's just say by ISIS or whatever it is, then are you going to have ideological immunity to revenge from capitalism? Can that do it? And well, what and this is where, through our talks with Bevery, we initially started like in 2016 as pretty disenfranchised people, men and women all over around the world. And through going from isolated wisdom to, to this collaborative wisdom, we're able to work through this. And I think we have some really compelling arguments for where at least Bevery's mix of what it's trying to, or what the conclusions we've come to over all our studies, studying a lot of classics and delving into this material that other people quarantine. I think we've got a good mix. So I think this can be something that is inspiring. But okay, what was this goal? Has he achieved it? Which alternative solutions? Okay, let me just go through. What are the alternative interpretive frameworks and countermeasures of this? Radical differences, fascism versus free trade. Right, okay, so one of the reasons why people select fascism, actually, so yeah, urgency versus democracy, racial difference correlation, causative fascism versus free trade. So fascism and free trade actually on Wikipedia are actually competing ideologies. It's quite interesting from my research, and it's kind of like the authoritarian, like top down, like we're all one unified uh, uh, ecosystem. And it's similar to communism in that aspect. He even praised communist China as like a realization for many of his ideals. Um, and but free trade is the alternative. But again, free trade is this thing that allows different countries to trade to each other. Now, he quotes, cheap labor is slave labor. Refuse to import modern slaves. And he also calls for boycotting everything that is made by non-whites. So, quote, globalized capitalist markets are the enemy of racial autonomous. If an ethnocentric European future is to be achieved, global free markets and the trade of goods is to be discouraged at all costs. An environmentally conscious and moral society will never be able to economically compete with a society based on ever-increasing industrialization, urbanization, industrial output, and population increase. That's a factual statement, that bit. The cheaper labor and ignorance of environmental health will always result in cheaper goods produced with less effort and inevitably result in the control of the market. That's certainly true as well. That's like a more left libertarian stance. A Europe of nature, culture, and sustainable living practicing will not be able to ever compete in the global market. The global market thus therefore never be allowed to compete in the new European market. Barring the importation of all goods produced outside the new European zone is an essential pillar of the future of Western economy. Goods produced without care for the natural world, dignity of workers, lasting culture of white civilizations should never be allowed into the new morally focused or ethnically focused European market. I think I stuffed that sentence up, but whatever. Cheap labor and all-consuming industry are not ideals. Block foreign goods from white markets. This will not get far. Even like one of the benefits, so globalism has its problems, but and we touched on this in the last call. There was several things that I never studied economics. I studied politics first and then economics. That was a mistake because at the end of the day, politics is like everything comes down to how do we manage scarcity, and that's and the study of economics is how can we create incentives that align to positive outcomes in this game theory game or in a game in a system. So what are the inputs and outputs and how can we modify them in that system? And then you have like the capitalist, which is I just want to be for profit at all costs. So the economists and the government, the politician will recruit economists to try and find out how to bend outcomes. But it's really hard because so the big threat, like the whole reason why China is a threat to the USA or whatever it is, or maybe India is also a threat to China, is because, and why governments care so much about GDP and output, is because if you have a national economy, you can only produce within that nation. And that's what it's called autocry. There's a specific term for that, like a self-sufficient nation. And that's the problem is that you now have a system of like, let's say the population, like for Australia, will be like 7 million units, right? And if they're completely national and they don't do any foreign trade, then you have to hope to hell your economy will be able to defend itself against a China with a population of 1 billion, which is now an economic force way higher. And this is kind of like the GDP. The GDP is kind of like the measure of the value that a country has reached in its contending with production. So it's but you have an issue here with competitive threats. So, for instance, if you can't defend yourself against a more powerful force, then how are you meant to? So his solution to that was, well, let's just eliminate all our competitors. But
As if that
then,
worked out real well the first time.
yeah, I think in a pre-call you talked about the Japan situation. Can you
Yeah. I was just
reiterate
thinking
that?
about that, the sort of like the economic isolationism of Japan that we sort of went over in our Rape of Nanking discussion, which was incredibly fascinating to really understand, like, oh, this sort of like uber nationalistic ideology works up to a point. But if your population raises to a certain degree and you're an economic isolationist and you've run out of resources, then you're going to have some sort of uh, reciprocal relationship with the other nations that are there. And so that was the problem with World War II Japan, and also some of those same problems going on prior to that as well. That led to them having to make that decision of global domination, or at least some sort of like domination of all the other
Right.
countries. And so like he's falling into that same sort of trap of like, this is a nation, or this is a world, not a worldview. This is a system that is always ultimately relying upon feed me Seymour, of having to conquer. And that's just not a very feasible um, ideology to have to rely upon. And as somebody that is wanting some sort of political stability as what provides for an extended existence across time, then having to always be at war with other nations just seems like not the type of nation that I'd want to live within or raise a
Right.
family within. And so it's like, if his ultimate goal is to provide an existence for the continuation of the white European race, then he's just falling into that same trap that Hitler and the other fascists of the 21st century went down. That, like, why do we need to play that game again? Why can't we actually recognize that there are some benefits to a globalist reciprocal relationships between nations, but while also understanding that having some sort of unique identity or community to exist within is incredibly meaningful to human psychology. And like
Right.
that was something that was fostered within World War II and the Nazi Party. And I don't know how much, and it's even something that's fostered within like Islam. And that, as we brought up earlier, the reason that a lot of like white Western people are persuaded or seduced by ISIS is because of that strong sense of meaning and community that it can be providing to them. But I'm hoping that this sort of sense of community can be fostered without having to rely upon extremist worldviews that are ultimately self-destructive. So that's
Mm.
why, like, I'm not very persuaded by this paper for multiple reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, right? Because one of the contentions he has, right, is like securing the future for white people. That's pretty much like the slogan for every white nationalist, right? It's also the slogan for, replace white there with any ethno thing. And that's the same thing for like Israel for the Jews, or um, what's happening right now in South Africa to an extent with the blacks or whatever. Like, or for whatever reason it is, an empathetic group to their own kind wants to survive, be it if you reduce that empathetic group to the individual or the family. And, to an extent, your privilege is like how far you can extend that. Like if you're in a lower classes, you're focused on probably your own survival, your family survival. You don't get to extend your privilege that far. You will, if you can't afford food, you will steal. Um, and so your empathetic ability really reduces. Now, in terms of the overall theme here, yeah, the raising of Japan is interesting, and I would say like world domination is probably a bit intense. It was specifically forced emigration, so
Right.
immigration, but with an E. And we covered that very well in the Rape in Nanking, as well as the Jordan B. Peterson, no, World War II history, no, Eastern World War II history. We did another video on that. And it's really hard because we need to say, okay, well, if that's the concern for this demographic, right? Like securing a future for the white people. So whatever alternative we provide has to be able to do that. Now, can capitalism do that? Well, to some extent, there's some flaws with that. And his outline was, well, like the NGOs and the government, like in Europe, they're all cronied up and they're amassing the importation of this cheap labor from external countries, right? And well, how do you fight that? And his only alternative is, well, let's just kill them all, right? Now, that is not a what you would use the word serious, I think, but a feasible. Feasible is the right word for that. I think we both agree. That's not a feasible solution because, again, it goes back to that eye for an eye issue. And even if you were to secure a future for the white people, Europe has always had contention. Whenever scarcity arises, contention arises.
Yeah.
Europe is a bunch of several different countries because they had contentions and they wanted to kill each other when scarcity arose.
Yeah, just because you and I share the same skin color doesn't mean that like when the chips are down and there's not enough resources for the both of us, I'm not going to kill you and feed my family, or you're not going to try and kill me. Like that's the thing. Like this whole shared commonality that you and I have just because we were raised with some sort of Western cultural identity is it's not very much to actually have a like strong foundation upon. And that's like one thing that capitalism does very well is it actually provides people with the means to provide themselves with the resources to exist within. So, although there are some issues with that currently with not being able to like have enough money to raise a family and other problems like that also arise.
Which is actually something we covered in our political instability talks recently. Which is quite good about like the cyclic nature of political instability and that as the gap between the wealthy and the have-nots increases, it results in a lot of rioting and all the things that we're kind of actually seeing in the USA. So those are
that was predicted by that author as well. Yeah, which was fascinating. Even though it wasn't, sorry. I was just going to say, even though he had like no basis to predict these exact reasons for these riots, but the mere fact that they would occur, he had a prediction, 10 years back, I think was,
all right. So the thing is, like, let's say then, okay, so this is the fascist thing, right? Like fascism is a alternative to free trade. So let's say we kill all the non-whites, right? And then we set up our Utopia Europe.
Clip it. Like, no, I'm just kidding.
Right. Well, then first thing we have to have is now we need to solve the scarcity issue, right?
Yeah.
Now, fascism doesn't solve the scarcity issue, as you outlined. It requires constant invasion or power battles to always redeem itself. And so the reason why capitalism has infiltrated everywhere is it is incredibly good at solving scarcity because it's incredibly good at getting anybody to cooperate. And beyond ideology or whatever it is, because now there's a universal tool of exchange. And in a free market, it's consensual, and a role of a government is a liberal government is to maintain a free market, to eliminate anti-competitive monopolies, and to eliminate coercion of employees to make sure unions are able to function, but also that unions aren't coercing employers. It is to make sure that the incentives are aligned for fruitful cooperation. Now, this is what Frederick Basic said about, and what the author correctly, Brenton correctly notes in this manifesto, which is, well, that's fine and dandy, but in Europe right now, or where it is, capitalism also just fuels government and is all crony and corrupt. Now, that's also why the libertarians have taken a staunch stance written in The Law by Frederick Baystar, which is a government cannot move into philanthropy. It needs to have a constitution that maintains liberty, never offer collective rights. As soon as it does, then cronyism is the only result and it snowballs. So if we then say, okay, so we have that, right? And because we need to, if we're just reverting back in history, then the same issues of what these future ideologies solve will come into forefront. So if we introduce fascism, then capitalism will arise. So we need something that actually transcends these things. And now globalism, that's not like, that's a big can of worms. UN isn't enticing at all. The UN agenda for like, what is it, 2020? The year we're currently in, I think, is like terrifying. It's just like one Illuminati government that controls everything. It's and then uses like anti-competitive practices to force all other governments to be part of it. We have like a discussion thread on the Bevery thing. It's not inspiring. It's terrifying. So I like, and then you view movies like The Whistleblower. I know, yeah, The Whistleblower, where it's like the UN is like involved in like child pedophilia rings and things in is it Ukraine? And it's just like, and if you're employed by the UN, then you're a national, and a national can't be prosecuted. They have immunity, and then it's a debate. Well, that just grants them impunity. They can do whatever they want. It is like a whole can of worms for that. Like brilliant.
Goes above the law. Wow.
That. Yeah, it is. It is fantastic, that movie, and like well done to the lady who did those leaks and had the courage. Like well done, and she actually inspired her as well as the woman who leaked in official secrets, who noted that the government, the USA government and the UK government were illegally doing a war in the Arab world on faulty evidence. She worked for the British intelligence agency. She leaked that. So like, yeah, corrupt global governments, real thing, terrifying, not good. Any whistleblower movie seems to be like, yeah, stay away. It doesn't work out the way you thought. So in my little Twitter portfolio, and I don't mean this as like a self-promotion thing, it's just incidental that I have it here and I haven't formally had the time, but I think the right combination here to solve these concerns, as well as the concerns that I see today, is global citizenship, contextual culture, self-governance, and a borderless economy, right? So you can have like nationalism with a global culture, right? You don't have to be fully self-sufficient. And actually, to explain this, why is self-sufficiency bad? Well, self-sufficiency is bad because it requires you to be able to compete. And if you can't compete, you'll be a minority and you will be oppressed. That's the way it works. It's so for instance, like it's the same reason why Russia and the USA have like an insane amount of nuclear weapons. You do not want one person with all the power, and why the little governments always like end up, forming allegiances with the bigger governments, and why it's also very problematic for like a new country to form, like Somaliland or Liberland. Because otherwise a bigger force will be like, you're treading on my territory, you're out. This is what the cartel does. Any gang, any, thing that views you as competition. It's like survival or natural selection, whatever you want to term it as, like mimetic evolution. So it's very problematic. So what you need is, and a great game to illustrate this is the game Risk. It's like there's a world map and you try and dominate the entire world. And you can form allegiances with other players, especially on the mobile apps, right? But what you will quickly realize is dignity and honor mean nothing unless you have leverage. like maybe 1 out of 10 players will have honor, which is if you form an allegiance, you'll continue that allegiance even if you're useless, right? Like even if you get your pieces done, right? So what you realize is for 9 out of 10 people, whatever it is, that they will kill you as soon as you're no longer valuable. Um, it's like a, what is it? A pig eat pig world? Is that what the thing is? Like
Dog eat
something
dog
eat something
world.
dog eat dog world,
Yeah.
right? In terms of competitive forces, right? And that's also ways like eliminate competition. But as we say, we don't think that's sufficient. So what is the alternative? So I think global trade is great because it increases resiliency. Let's say China goes under or another country goes under, then it can we have fallbacks. We have alternative nations we can fall back on, and that increased dependency, this interweaving of economic forces, actually incredibly disincentivizes violent competition. Because if you're killing the people who are feeding you, you're not inclined to do that. And this is what Japan realized after World War II, which is okay, we can't forcibly emigrate out. Instead, let's focus on things which we can do that is specialized value. Let's do things that are not redundant. Let's make things that if we were to go under, the rest of the world would suffer because they need it. Whereas if you're setting up a national economy and you're just doing redundant efforts because you're just trying to compete, even though you're not the best, then you're making everyone poorer because they're spending more resources on reproduction when they could get something cheaper. It actually dramatically decreases your ability to compete. It dramatically decreases your livelihood and your quality of life because you're spending more on less value compared to what the alternatives do. This is the entire point, economic point of import duties, import taxes. The whole point of that is to increase the cost to the consumer and to the consumer so that demand for foreign supply will go down, to turn the hand of the foreign supplier to build a factory locally, or to hope that national competition catches up to meet foreign demand. It is to punish the consumer. It is not good. But it's also necessary at this point in the world where everyone has import duties against everyone else. It's a negotiation tactic. So, so that's like this whole range of issues there. So it would be good to have this global trade or this borderless economy. And by borderless, I actually mean this even for companies. This is a very left-leaning stance here, which is take all the borders away, get rid of all the secrets, all the NDAs, all the confidentiality. Everything's public. Bevery, we're trying to run it as an open company. This is a documented thing, but if we can open everything up, then perverse competition, like keeping secrets only because it benefits you and not your competitors, that doesn't seem to be competitively fruitful. And yet secrets is the thing that prevents open source from being able to compete. And it's the same thing for governments. Like the reason the government can enforce tyranny, like say with the Snowden revelations or mass surveillance, right? Like, or the reasons why governments are powerful is because they hold secrets. And official secrets is a good example of this, which is that you can be persecuted in the UK for releasing a government secret. And that's one of the things. A government, and the government is the one who sues themselves. They're the ones who arrest themselves. So the government dropped the case against the person because the government didn't want to reveal evidence that would show the war was illegal, because that would incriminate them. So why would they pursue a court case that would incriminate them? Instead, they'll just drop the court case. Very interesting thing. So what you want is you want to reduce secrets, reduce confidentiality, promote collaboration, and reduce the need for blood perverse competition, right? So this is like community collaboration, borderless from all tribes or companies, any type of tribe. You want collaboration and competition because it fuels benefit for the consumer and for the producer. Like patents in the tech world is a great example of this, like, or in pharmaceuticals. Like there's a great documentary, it's like blood something, blood drugs or something like that, about how patent usage of pharmaceuticals in Africa is incredibly problematic. Whereas in India, they set up their own pharmaceutical land. So for instance, in Africa, they depended on foreign or USA, well, just foreign pharmaceutical companies. But the foreign pharmaceutical companies were like, you can't violate our patents, otherwise we'll withdraw all the drugs we supply you. We'll just pull out completely and you'll be left with no drugs. Whereas India were like, okay, let's produce our own drugs. And that way, if any foreign thing pulls it out, then it's not going to be an issue. Now, that's where it is monopolistic force and an anti-competitive monopolistic force. You want competition. So something that left libertarians know, that right libertarians need to be on board with, is we need to eliminate secrets, patents. Intellectual property is a big thing that will facilitate collaboration tremendously. Now, self-governance is the other one. But this is another issue. So like, oh, good thing. So I point to raise whatever. We've talked about this many times on Bevery, which is the idea of a telos as like the value of a group. And then you have the normativeness, which is the funnel. And then you have the ethos, which is how that is achieved. So you want, for a company or a community, the most minimal telos to facilitate the greatest normativeness, the greatest diversity to achieve a coherent ethos. Now, if you have but even if you have the most, like say, a libertarian telos, which will facilitate all groups under it, providing they're not going to use oppressive force, then it will still allow, then you still need groups to be able to have sovereignty. But then there would be like group on group competition, which the highest telos would be you don't get to fight against each other. You don't get to do coercive force, right? Now, then there would be defense, and that is a different can of worms in that width. But you want to minimize the use of defense because you want to facilitate abundance of resources through interdependence and cooperation. So by having a telos which is no coercion, then the groups underneath it have to abide by no coercion. So they have to get along as well. And this is like for any family, for instance, like any family with the children, they put no coercion on. The two children have to get along even though they have different personalities. But it also allows for self-governance. So for instance, in Hong Kong, to facilitate this telos thing, like it doesn't make sense for a cultural clash, right? Like and this is something that was deliberately done to the Arab world and deliberately done to Africa, which was let's get different races, which is ethno-cultures, ethnicity and culture. I'm not doing causation, I'm just doing a correlation, right? That have unique traditions, heritage, tied to certain geographical areas. And then just like, let's just put a country around many of them or even slice some in between. So that way you now have people who previously did get along now with people who didn't, who are now battling over resources. It was in like say the Arab world, it was a deliberate move to keep the Arab world suppressed, which is why ISIS became such a big thing. They didn't really like with a Western intervention that happened to deliberately destabilize them to prevent them from becoming a threat. So in modern instance, we see this with Hong Kong. Now, why would some aristocrats who sign a piece of paper determine the freedom and the liberty of a few million people in Hong Kong? How that makes any sense doesn't make sense. If people want to be amassed in a particular group with particular rights, with particular laws, let them. But this is the competition thing. The world needs to come together where it's like, you don't get to do coercive treatment. That's the telos we're outlining. You need to let people have self-governance until and hopefully that will happen, and capitalism seems to help facilitate that to an extent. But then the solution to current capitalistic corruption is rioting and revolution, and it works well for capitalistic corruption. That is when government fails. The other one here is contextual culture, right? And this is important because even in local communities or countries, you have a culture, and these cultures depend on like an environment. So for instance, in Bali, you know, they have a different culture or whatever, or in the Arab world, they have different cultures. And it doesn't make sense to just be like, let's grab people who have one particular culture and inject them into another area. It doesn't work well. We need to allow subcultures. We need to allow people to get along. And that's like a big concern with globalism, like, which is everything's just going to be one nation, one amalgamation of everything. Maybe if the UN has that way, that maybe that'll be it. I don't know. But you don't need, you can separate globalism or global trade, like a borderless economy, um, away from culture. You can allow subcultures to exist, and we should respect them and respect that diversity. But and then the last bit in here is global citizenship, and the global citizenship is like free movement. And for instance, like in Australia, we allow a lot of immigration and land ownership from other nations into Australia. Like a sizable proportion of land in Sydney is owned by Chinese, which is kind of like a little concern. But at the same time, like China, many of the Asian countries don't allow Australia to own land or Australians to own land. And I think that needs to be a reciprocal trade. So for instance, USA and India, they actually have a thing called a reciprocal visa. You can spend 10 years if you're an American in India in one go under one visa. That is amazing. Like if you're like, man, my life sucks in America, you could just go to India and then like $10,000 will get you quite far in India, right? So like you could be sipping martinis on Goa, dancing with like some girls and everything like that. It's a pretty good life. Do what the Aussies do with Bali, right? So 10 years is really good, but for at least for Australians, like most places are like 3 months. Now, again, if I have certain resources, how does it make sense for me to like, let's say, spend $2,000 a month on an apartment in Sydney when I can get a better quality apartment in Kuala Lumpur for $500 a month? I will now have more resources for myself to put towards the efforts and the initiatives I care about if I make sure I spend the minimal amount of money on things I agree with. And like, you know, boycott the things I don't. I'm vegan, so I don't participate and fund animal cruelty, but it gives me more money to put towards the things I do. So we do want a situation where people can travel between, but they must respect the culture. This is one of the important things. I shouldn't be able to go to the Arab world and then be like, oi, you guys need to respect me and not call me an infidel. That doesn't seem to be a smart idea. In the same way, they shouldn't go towards another culture and then say, you must now abide to me. This is a part of diversity and why diversity is valuable, which is we should allow, when we go somewhere else, we should respect it and respect their culture and what they stand for. We shouldn't go there and then try and turn it into another version of our own culture. So I think like that amalgamation, which is what a lot of things are working towards, a lot of incentives like left libertarianism, right libertarianism, does seem to go to, seems to facilitate that. But even like just the forces of capitalism, the forces of socialism, these things. I have a blog post called Where Socialism Fits, where I talk about like the cyclic nature of where socialism comes in. But I mean, this is the thing, there's lots of contention towards other solutions that don't suffer the same like insufficiencies or infeasibilities as what was presented in this radical solution. There is good options available. And that was like a wide breadth of like a different amount of it, but this is important. The only other thing I want to raise in that, but I'll let John talk for a bit, is
no. In fact, I need to head out pretty soon. So if we're on the last little bits, we can go through those quickly.
Yep. So then the last bit is actually, Bevery, we have our own little manifesto, and this is why we actually felt the confidence in being able to deal with this. So if you go to bevery.me, in the link below, you actually go to the Bevery Manifesto, and it's not that long of a read, but it talks a lot about the same issues, right? Like, so Bevery, which means to liberate in Afrikaans, is an initiative to see everyone enable everyone enabled to do what they love, share it with the world, and live well. But this is noble. However, it is not without its challenges. What to do about someone who wishes to harm others without consent? What about the trolley problem? What about tribes, be them conceptual, such as identity, or tangible, such as geographical, that face grave scarcity and conflicting ideals that prevent them from sharing? What to overcome these challenges, three pillars are critical. We have philosophy. We must pursue things that are real, substantial, and meaningful. Too often, people cling to axioms that are only superficially real, despite how comfortable they may be. Projects, we must not only solve problems, but must also realize the solutions. Too often, people only talk about solutions, not build them. In praxis, we must operate day to day as humans that are capable of revision. Too often, people know what to do, however, fail to enact the routines and practices to achieve the self-actualization. These pillars have led us to conclude that self-actualization of the individual is the highest ideal, or even self-transcendence. We need to update that bit. That its manifestation is only possible when aggression is constrained to a proportional level of defense, such as consent is reasonably upheld. So otherwise, power is sustained by might makes right and not by reason. For power to reflect reason and not might, power must reside solely in each individual, as otherwise its delegation increases the distance between responsibility and accountability, with the restricted and restricted becoming different entities. This is like the work by Eleanor Ostrom. Power must exist in those capable of enforcing reason, which are individuals, without violating the rights of another. The delicacy of how to do this is the development of wisdom. Wisdom is what allows us to grow beyond the fear of vulnerability through the development and the strength to survive exploitation and overcome. So what happens when two people's reasoning for current wisdom is at odds? Well, we have imposition, where either party can impose their worldview on the other and disregards consent. This is like the eye for an eye ideology. We also have revision, where both parties talk it out and either reach reconciliation, where flaws in reasoning or application are spotted and humility is deployed and adapt, or acceptance, where validation of reasoning may show that both approaches are valid, or indeterminate, in which case they can go their own ways, with acceptance where peace is possible, or with imposition where protection of one's consent from scarcity is necessary. So how do we optimize for revision while reducing the risk of imposition? We must get people talking and learning from each other with the safety and inclination to do so. This progress is threefold. So we have isolated wisdom, conversational wisdom, and collaborative wisdom. Now, isolated wisdom is pretty much, for most people, they start off, they have their own suppositions about the world, their own axioms, they go and get challenged a bit. And then they finally find like a group, an ideology, a religion, a community that actually shares some of the beliefs they have. And like, yes, this feels right. I vibe with this. This is great. But what is the vector for truth here, of reality here? Well, it's just social validation. We need to go beyond that into something that is actually collaborative, because something that is just collective is also competitive. We need to do something that is collaborative, which is talk with our enemies, figure out better solutions, and go further than that. And that's kind of talked about more in that thing, in the manifesto below. And I think this is really important. This is what we're seeing on YouTube with like the rise of many of these, people like Sam Harris, or even like, Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, a lot of people we've covered, or even people like Sargon of Akkad or JFP, JFP, or whatever it is.
JFG.
Yeah, JFG. And, these are people engaging in a conversation, and that pushes us forward to solutions that are actually real, because you don't want to wake up and realize you're in the matrix. And you also don't want to wake up to realize that your fantasy is untrue. You want to make sure that what you are moving towards is always ever increasingly correct. And that also involves challenging your axioms every step along the way, and making sure that they're good. So John, anything you want to add?
No, I'm actually really happy with everything that we went through here. I think we made sure to take on the actual points of the manifesto and try to actually consider it with care and deliberation. and responding to it with uncertainty where we're uncertain, and with alternate possibilities for solutions rather than the ones that he presents. And I think we did so with a quite adequate job. I'm quite happy with both of us in how we responded to this paper. And I think it's a really effective or not a really worthwhile attempt to actually go through, rather than just sort of like keeping it outside of the Overton window, disregard it, not try to confront it at all, but actually wrestle with the ideas that he puts forward and actually consider where there's truth to the matter, such as the problem that he sees, and consider with respect and seriousness the prescriptions that he lays out in response to those, and whether or not those prescriptions would actually adequately respond to the problems and provide or satisfaction for the ends or the values or the goals that he was attempting. I think we did a great job there.
Right. Yeah. So, because one of the things is, I hope what we demonstrated is his conclusions, like the threats he perceived are in some way very real, and depending on which exact threat, some are very real, some are a little bit less real, and these need to be taken seriously. But we think his conclusion in large is infeasible. It certainly is a solution, but we don't think it's a long-term solution that actually solves the problem. It just seems to repeat more problems. And there's other ways, more innovative ways that we can go towards in the future and march towards, to use like that type of language, is that could solve the problems in new ways. Now, is that immediately going to solve, like, non-white overpopulation or whatever it is? Well, probably not, but we don't think that there is a way to solve those issues that well. There's other ways to overcome it, which would be to de-radicalize pretty much everybody. And that's not to say that leave them as empty vessels. It's to say, let them find something that is meaningful and invigorates them, and something that aligns with the world and allows that type of freedom and assimilation, or sorry, association that governments, that culture, with those who want it. Like, so even in the US, like with what happened with Chad, how they seized that suburb by force, it's just like, why do these people need to claim it by force? Just let them run their experiments consensually, but don't let them keep their children against their will. If the child wants to leave, let them leave. Let them learn the hard way. Let them take the medicine that may be bitter, right? Because that provides a solution where we actually have freedom that actually has benefits. Thing we didn't mention in the last thing, but I wish we did, is a lot of this type of freedom that they talk about, I don't see benefit to it. Like, freedom is something that actually gives me benefits that I want in my life. Whereas if I'm just like in the woods competing against nature, that's not fun. That's a waste of my potential. Like, why would I do that when I can solve massive issues of scarcity? That's the thing.
Better use of your time.
Yeah. And if we provide wealth and provide collaboration and assistance to people, and that's like, sure, maybe they'll say that the NGOs have been trying to do that in Europe, but at the same time, we're also saying, well, it's a contextual culture. Like, there needs to actually be borders on culture, not really borders, but culture needs to be respected. Like, you do not get to go into Africa or in Europe unless you're going to respect the culture there. That is incredibly important, because otherwise you will just get clash and clash and clash and clash as soon as resources get scarce. And you need to allow the cultures to figure it out themselves and build trade with each other. That provides peace. It doesn't provide the clashing. So if you're listening to this, let us actually know your arguments, because this was one hell of a thing we wrestled with over the week. And from our knowledge, this is the first time counter arguments have actually been provided, or even an honest evaluation of his arguments. We actually gave a lot of praise to his observations. So we will actually want to hear your arguments, like for and against, because a conversation needs to happen. And for ideology, it's just like a normal virus. These are mimetic viruses. Sometimes, if you increase your exposure, just like a healthy person, you increase your exposure, you get a better immune system, you can travel more, you can embrace more, you can be more open with risk, because you have that immunity and that capacity, that wisdom to deal with it. So just like this, just like the radicalization efforts, increased exposure will increase immunity, providing it's done without censorship and done with respect and due diligence and without coercion. So, alrighty, yeah. So really keen to hear what everyone thinks. We do these type of discussions every week. Thanks so much, John, for joining me. You can find me on Twitter at WriterJohnBuck. You can find myself at BA Lupton. Hopefully that was a good idea, sharing my last name, but they'll find it out anyway. I've been having things of like, geez, what are people going to clip out of this? What are the journalists going to do? But I think as you say, I think we covered this really well. And you can get all the descriptions in the details below. We'll share some more of our notes. And yeah, I'm really happy with how this went. All right, I'll end the live stream now. So, but we got to wait for it to sync. So yeah, all the description of the video below. Like, comment, subscribe, get more of it. Bye.